Hi, welcome to Pyrography Made Easy. I'm Brenda. In this beginner-friendly tutorial, I am going to show you 5 different ways to create whiskers. Well, let's get started. Avoidance. With the avoidance method, you have pencil lines that mark the location of the whiskers. You start burning in the fur and/or background while avoiding those pencil marks. I've used this method with the bobcat artwork. It is a great method to use on dark backgrounds or areas without a lot of texture or color variety. It is important to keep the pen tip in optimal position when burning next to the edges of the whiskers. This will help ensure that the whiskers have crisp, clean edges on them. Erase the pencil marks once they are no longer needed to reveal the whiskers. Graphite pencil can be hard to see, so I like to use white charcoal instead of graphite. I normally use the General's brand of white charcoal. It is readily found online and in many art stores. Do not use colored pencil. Colored pencils contain wax that will melt and char under the heat of the pen tip. As far as the graphite or white charcoal go, regardless of which one is used, you still need to avoid burning over the whisker pencil lines. That also means you need to rotate the board as needed as you work around the whiskers. Now let's talk about the pros and cons of the avoidance method. Let's start with the pros. It's easy to draw the whiskers. It's easy to create arched or curved whiskers. This one is easier to fix mistakes when compared to most of the other methods. It doesn't damage the board. You can burn over the whiskers to give them color and a 3D shape. It's a great method if the background is fairly uniform in color or lacks texture. Now let's talk about the cons. If you have a busy background or something with a lot of texture, it is really hard to avoid burning over the whiskers. It is difficult to avoid the whiskers in areas where they overlap a lot. It is easy to accidentally burn over a whisker. Emboss. Begin by drawing your whiskers, and then use an embossing tool and firmly press it into the wood. Follow the contours of the pencil lines. This will create a channel or a groove in the wood. Embossing tools are also called ball stylus tools. It will probably take a couple of passes over the pencil lines before the embossed line is deep enough. You need a deeply grooved line to get good results with this method. After the whiskers are deeply embossed and any trace lines are burned in, then rub over the area to remove any residual graphite. Now, burn the artwork as you normally would. If the embossed lines are deep enough, you do not need to avoid burning over them. There is an exception to this. If you are using the razor edge of the shader and burning in the same direction of the whiskers, it is very easy for the edge of the shader to drop down into the bottom of the embossed line. If you get into a situation like this, try to avoid burning over the embossed lines. Or, if it's feasible, use the flat of the shader. The more metal in contact with the wood will help the pen tip glide over the embossed lines. I used this method on the lioness artwork, and it's great in areas where the fur is not very dark. Now let's talk about the pros. You can burn over the whisker lines. It's easy to create deep embossed lines on soft woods. The whiskers have a 3D look due to the shadows from the grooved lines. Now for the cons. It is difficult to emboss on plywood and hardwoods. It can be tough to create individual whiskers if they overlap each other a lot. It is easy to char shallow embossed lines. The razor edge of the pen tip can fall into the bottom of the groove line and darken it up. It can be tough to create thin, tapered points on the whiskers. The size of the embossing tool controls the width or the thickness of the whisker. It can be hard to uniformly thicken a whisker. Scraping. With the scraping method, the whiskers are created after the artwork is burned in. So begin by creating the artwork. Once you are done, use a white, charcoal, or colored pencil and draw in the whiskers. Don't worry if you end up with faint lines for your whiskers. If you can see them, that is good enough for this method. Now use the tip of a sharp knife and gently scrape along the pencil lines to create the whiskers. If you are working with plywood, you need to be extra careful because this method can remove small chips of wood. The red arrow is pointing to a spot where this happened. Let's cover the pros of the scraping method. It is done after the burning is finished. You can create very thin whiskers with tapered points. Now let's cover the cons. It can be hard to control the shape of the whisker. This damages the board. It can cause chipping in plywood. In areas where the whiskers overlap, it can be tough to create individual whiskers. In some, and maybe all, pyrography contests, the scrape marks are considered flaws. After you are done scraping, rub over the area with an eraser to remove any residual pencil marks. Add color. The fourth method is done by using color to create the whiskers after the burning is finished. I am using different brands of white colored pencil for this. Prismacolor was the first one, Polychromos the second, and lastly, Soho. None of the brands of colored pencil are opaque enough to show up well on the pyrography, especially where it's dark. I used a white-colored pencil to create the whiskers that overlapped onto the unburned background on the cougar. This way they showed up. All of the rest of the whiskers on the cougar were created using the scraping method. Now I am using a white gel pen. This is very opaque and creates a wonderfully thin whisker, but I have no idea how light-fast it is. Lastly, you can use a paintbrush and acrylic paints to create whiskers. The paint is opaque, but as you can see, I have difficulty using a paintbrush. Now for the pros and cons. This is done after the burning is over. You can control the size and shape of the whiskers. You can use any color or combination of colors to create very realistic looking whiskers. Some mediums don't show up very well over pyrography. If the board is rough, it might be tough to control the shape of the whisker. It can be difficult to fix mistakes. If the medium is not light fast, it will fade. The medium might react with the wood finish, so make sure to test it out on a piece of scrap wood before you use it on your artwork. Combinations. There are numerous combinations. with the most obvious being the use of 2 or more of the previous methods I've already explained. For example, on this jaguar artwork, I started out by embossing the whiskers. Afterwards, I burned in the artwork as I normally would. Since the whiskers were so thin, I was fairly sure I would lose them when I started burning darkly. And I did, despite the fact that I was trying to avoid the whiskers. I used the third method and scraped the whiskers back into existence after I was done burning the artwork. And lastly, I used a white colored pencil to add a little color to the whiskers so they would stand out. A less obvious combination begins by darkly burning in the whiskers. Initially, burn over them lightly to set their shape. You can also think of this as scoring the wood. Then re-burn over the whiskers. Now you want the burn marks to be very dark in color. The micro writer pen tip I am using keeps catching on the plywood texture, so my lines are not very smooth. I switched to a standard writer pen tip. It is larger and glides over the wood surface better. The lines need to be both dark and deep. Think of it as embossing the lines with heat, but without using any pressure. In fact, it is important not to press the pen tip down into the wood, as you can damage the pen tip. After the whiskers have been deeply and darkly burned in, then create the pyrography artwork as normal. This is how my demo looked once I was done with the pyrography. Now use the tip of a sharp knife and gently scrape along the dark whisker lines. If you are working with plywood, it is less likely to chip out now because the lines were first burned in. Also, I find it is helpful to rotate the board and scrape along the whiskers in different directions. I used this method to create the whiskers on the Bengal tiger artwork. Let's discuss the pros. You have a lot of control over how the whisker will look. You can take features of different methods to eliminate possible problems. For example, pre-burning to help stop chipping in plywood. Now for the cons. There are more steps involved. It takes more planning because some steps are done before the burning and some steps are done after the burning is completed. Inherent problems with one method are still present. Well, that's it for this tutorial. I hope you found the information informative. On my website, Pyrography Made Easy, I have the written version of this tutorial, and I'll put a link to that in the description below. Well, thank you for watching, and I will see you next week.